A Dark Tale and Grimm. Opening credits. Once upon a time, fairy tales were awesome. I know. You don't believe me. And I don't blame you. A little while ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Little girls in red capes, skipping around the forest. Awesome? I don't think so. But then you start to read them. The really grim ones. A very few little girls in red capes in those. Well, there is one, but she gets eaten. Okay, you're probably saying. If fairy tales are awesome, why, in all the ones I have heard, so unbelievably mind-numbing boring? Well, you know how it is with these stories. Someone tells a story, and then someone repeats it, and it changes. Someone else repeats it, and it changes again. Then someone's telling their kid, and taking all of the scary, bloody scenes. In other words, the awesome parts. And the next thing you know, the story about an adorable little girl in a red cape skipping through the forest to take cookies to her granny. And you're so bored, you might have passed out on the floor. The real Grimm stories are not like that. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook and eat them. Which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and she's baked to death. Which is pretty cool, I have to admit. But maybe it's not awesome. Especially, and here's the thing, that's not the real story of Hansel and Gretel. You see, there is another story in Grimm's fairy tales. A story that winds all throughout its modest, mysterious tone. Like all trail and breadcrumbs winding through the forest. It appears in tales you may have never heard of, such as Fateful Johannes and Brother and Sister, and in some that you have, Hansel and Gretel, for instance. In this story of two children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel, travel through a magical and terrifying world. It is in this story of two children striving and failing, and then not failing. It is the story of two children finding out the meaning of things. Before I go on, a word of warning. Grimm's stories, the ones that were changed for little kids, are violent and bloody. And what you're going to hear now, the one true tale of the tales of Grimm, is as violent and bloody as you can imagine. Really. So if such things bother you, you should probably stop right now. You see, the land of Grimm can be a harrowing place. But it's worth exploring, for in life, is it in the darkest zones, finds the brightest beauty and most luminous wisdom. And of course, in blood. Once upon a time, in the kingdom of Grimm, an old king laid on his deathbed. He was Hansel and Gretel's great-grandfather. But he didn't know that, for neither Hansel and Gretel were not born yet. Now hold on a minute. I know what you're thinking. And I'm very well aware that nobody wants to hear a story that happened before the main character showed up. Stories like that are boring because they always end up the exact same way, with the main character showing up. But don't worry, this story is not no story you've never heard. You see, Hansel and Gretel don't show up at the end of this story. They show up, and then they get their heads cut off. Just thought you'd like to know. The old king knew he was going to pass from this world, so he called on his oldest and most faithful servant. The servant's name was Johannes. But he had served the king's father, and his father's father, and his father's father's father, so loyally that they all called him Faithful Johannes. Johannes trotted with his bound legs, having his crooked back step by step, and leering with his one good eye. His long nose sniffed the air, his mouth puckered around two rotten teeth. But despite his grotesque appearance, when he came within view, the old king smiled and said, "Ah, Johannes," and drew him near. The king's voice was weak, and he said, "I am soon to die, but before I go, you must promise me two things. First, promise me you will be faithful to my young son, as you have been to me." Without hesitation, Johannes promised. The king went on. "Secondly, promise you will show him his entire inheritance. The castle, the treasures, all the fine land, except for one room. Do not show him the room with the portrait of the golden princess. For if he sees the portrait, he will fall madly in love with her, and I fear it will cost him his life." The king gripped Johannes' hand. "Promise me." Again, Johannes promised. And the wrinkles of worry left the king's brow. He closed his eyes and breathed his last. Soon the prince was crowned as the new king. He celebrated with parades and toasts and feasts all throughout the kingdom. But when the revelry finally abated, Johannes sat him down for a talk. First, Johannes described to him all the responsibilities of the throne. The young king tried not to fall asleep. Then he exclaimed that the old king had asked him to show the young king his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, and all the fine land. The word treasures, the young king's face lit up. Not that he was greedy. He just found the idea of treasures exciting. Finally, Johannes tried to explain his own role to the young king. "I have served your father, your father's father, and your father's father's father before that," Johannes said. The young king started to calculate on his fingers how that was even possible. But before he could get very far, Johannes had moved on. "They call me Faithful Johannes because I have been devoted my life to the kings of Grimm, helping them, advising them, to understand them." "Understand them?" the young king asked. "No, understanding them. In an ancient sense of the word, standing beneath them, supporting them, bearing their troubles and pain on their shoulders." The young king thought about this. "So you will understand me too?" he asked. "I will. No matter what. Under any circumstances. That is what being faithful means." "Well, understand, I am tired of all this, and I would like to see the treasures now." And the young king stood up. Faithful Johannes shook his head and sighed. They began to explore every inch of the castle, the treasure crypts, the towers, every single room. That is, save for one. The room remained locked, no matter how many times they passed it. Well, the young king was no fool. He noticed this and asked, "Why is it, Johannes, that you show me every room in this palace, but not this room?" Johannes squinted with his one eye and curled up his puckered, two-toothed mouth and said, "Your father asked me not to show you that, Your Highness. He feared it might cost you your life." I'm sorry, I need to stop for a second. I don't know if you're thinking this right now, but when I first heard this part of the story, I thought, what? He's crazy. Maybe you know something about young people, maybe you don't. I, having been myself once upon a time ago, know a few things about them. One thing I know is that if you don't want one to do something, for example, go into a room where there's a portrait of an unbearably beautiful princess, saying it might cost you your life, is about the worst thing you could possibly say. Because then that's all the young person will want to do. Meaning, why did Johannes say something else? Like, it's the broom closet. Why do you want to see what's in a broom closet? Or, it's a fake door, silly, for a decoration. Or even, it's the ladies' bathroom, Your Majesty. Best not go poking your head in there. Any of them would perfectly suffice, as far as I can tell. But he didn't say any of those things. If had he not, none of the horrible bloody events would follow would ever happen. In that case, I'm glad he told the truth. "Cost me my life," the young king proclaimed with a toss of the head. "Nonsense!" He insisted to be let into the room. First he demanded, but Johannes refused. Then he commanded. Still, Johannes refused. Then he threw himself onto the floor and had a fit, which is very unbecoming of a young man in a king's age. Finally, faithful Johannes realized that there was little he could do. So his wrinkled, old, malformed face with a wince unlocked and opened the door. The king burst into the room, and he found himself staring face to face with the most beautiful portrait of the most beautiful woman you've ever seen in his life. Her hair looked like it was spun from pure gold thread. Her eyes flashed like the ocean on a sunny day. And yet around her lips was a hint of sadness, of loneliness. The young king took one look at her and fainted. Later in his room, he came to. Johannes hovered over his bed. "Who was that radiant creature?" the king asked. "That, Your Majesty, is the golden princess," Johannes answered. "She's the most beautiful woman in the world," the young king said. And Johannes answered, "Yes, she is. And yet she almost looks sad. Why is that?" Johannes took a deep breath and replied, "Because, young king, she is cursed. Every time she has tried to marry, her husband has died. And it is said that a fate worse than death is designed for her children, if she ever had any. She lives in the black marble palace, topped with a golden roof, all by herself. And as you can imagine, it has left her terribly lonely and terribly sad. The king sat straight up from his bed and grabbed the front of faithful Johannes's tunic. He thought he stared into the old man's face. He only saw the princess's gold, bright eyes, and her lips ringed with sadness. "I must have her," he said. "I will marry her, and I will save her." "You may not survive," Johannes said. "I will survive if you help me. If you are faithful to me, you will understand me. You will do it." Johannes feared the young king's life, but he had understood the young king's father and his father's father and his father's father's father before that. What could he say? Johannes sighed. "I will do it." It was widely known that in all the golden princess's days of loneliness, the only thing that gave her a modicum of happiness was gold. So Johannes told the king to gather all of the gold in the kingdom and to demand all the goldsmith to craft the most exquisite golden objects that the world has ever seen, which was soon done. Then Johannes disguised himself and the king as merchants and loaded the ship with golden goods. They set off for the land of the golden princess. As their ship plowed through the seas, Johannes tutored the king in his part. "You are a gold merchant, your majesty. The princess has always loved gold, but these days, it's the only thing that gives her any joy. So you will bring her to the ship, charm her not only with your gentle manners and fine looks, but also with the gold, and perhaps she will be yours." When they landed, the king read the ship and tended to his merchant costume, while Johannes, carrying a few golden objects in his bag, made his way to the towering ramparts of the black marble where the golden princess lived. He entered the courtyard and discovered a servant girl retrieving water from the well with a golden bucket. "Pretty maid," he said, smiling his kind but unhandsome smile. "Do you think your lady might be interested in such tiffining works of gold like these?" He produced two of the finest, most exquisite gold statues that man's hands has ever made. The girl was stunned by their beauty. She took them from Johannes and hurried within. Not 10 minutes had escalated before the golden princess herself emerged from the castle, holding the statues in her hand. She was just as gorgeous as her portrait, if not more so, in fact. As she greeted Johannes, her golden hair flashed in the light, and her ocean eyes danced with pleasure. Still, around her lips there was sadness. "Tell me, old man," she said, "are these really for sale? I have never seen anything so beautiful, so fine." Faithful Johannes bowed. "But there is far more, fair princess, much more. My master's ship is full with such wonders, and they can all be yours if you just accompany me down to the harbor." The princess hesitated for a moment. Since her last husband had died, she has not set foot outside the palace. But the allure of gold was too strong. She threw her shining travel cloak over her shoulders and followed Johannes to the boat. The young king, in his disguise as a merchant, greeted her. Her beauty was so stunning, her sadness so apparent, so tender, he nearly fainted again. But somehow he did not, and she smiled and invited him to show her all of the treasures he has brought to her fair land. As soon as they descended below deck, Johannes hurried the captain of the ship and in whispered tones instructed him to cast off shore and set sail for home immediately. Now, my young readers, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, stealing a girl. That's an interesting way of winning her heart. Allow me to warn you now, under any circumstances, stealing a girl is about the worst way of winning her heart you can possibly cook up. But because it happened a long time ago in a faraway land, it seemed to have worked. For the golden princess came back to the deck and saw that her land was far away from her. At first, she indeed protested, and fiercely too. She had been carried away by lone-born merchants. But when one of the merchants revealed himself to be king, in addition that he was madly in love with her, and when, beside, Johannes assured that if she really wanted to, she could go home, she couldn't take the gold as she did, and the princess realized, in fact, that the young king was the kind enough man that she would like to marry after all, and decided she would give the whole matrimony thing one last shot. And they lived happily ever after. The end. Are there any small children in the room? If so, it would be best if you think that this really is the end of the story, and then hurry them off to bed, because this is where things start to get awesome. But in a horrible, bloody kind of way. As the ship plowed through the purple sea, the new lovers made moon faces at each other up near the bow. Faithful Johannes was sitting near the back of the ship, admiring the success of his plan, until he noticed 3 ravens align the beam-mast. The first raven motioned with his beak to the king and princess. "What a lovely couple those two will make," he said. The second said, "Yes, too bad it won't stay that way." The first said, "What do you mean?" "Well," the second replied, "when the ship gets to land, a beautiful chestnut stallion will cater up to the group, and the king will decide to ride back on it to the castle. But if he does, he will be thrown off its back and die." "Oh God, that's horrible," the first raven said. "Is there nothing anybody can do?" "Oh, there is," the second raven said. "If someone could kill the horse before the king mounts it." "But what good is that for? For if someone did, they would be turned to stone, from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees." "To stone?" asked the first raven. "To stone," the second one answered. The third raven, who had been listening quietly, cut in at this point. "It gets worse, you know," he said. "For by some chance the 2 lovers escape the danger, another one lies ahead. For when they arrive to the gates of the castle, the beautiful bridal gown made of pure gold would be laying on a bed of purple flowers. The princess will want to wear it, of course, but when she touches it, she will be consumed by a ball of fire and burned to cinder right on the spot." "Oh God, that's terrible," cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anybody can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third raven. "For if someone were to pick up the dress before she could and throw it in the fire, the princess would live. But what good is that for? For someone did, and told why he did it. He will be turned to stone, from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart." "To stone?" repeated the first raven. "To stone," confirmed the third. "Nor is that all," the second raven said. "For the 2 lovers avoided the tragedy, a final one awaits. When they are married, they will begin their wedding dance, and the new queen will swoon, fall to the floor, and die." "Oh God, that's the worst one yet," cried the raven. "Is there nothing anybody can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third. "If someone were to bite the new queen's lips and suck 3 drops of blood from it into their mouths, they would live. But what good is that for? For if someone were to do it, and told why, he would be turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head. To stone, said the first. To stone, replied the second. To stone, echoed the third. And with that, the three ravens shook their black beaks and sighed sadly and flew away. Johannes buried his head in his hands, for he had heard it all. He knew what had to be done, and it could not come to good. Just as the ravens foretold, after the ship landed, and the king and soon-to-be wife were greeted by all of the servants and corridors of the castle, a beautiful chestnut stallion catered up to the group. The king, taken within the beast's beauty, announced that he would bear him in triumph back to the castle. Before he could mount it, Johannes slipped onto his back, drew a blade, and cut the horse's throat. It soaked its silk cloak with red, warm blood. It collapsed on the ground in a heap. The cries of shock went through the crowd. The other servants, who had never loved the mishap Johannes, whispered, "To kill the king's new stallion! Treason! Treason!" The king looked back and forth between Johannes and the dead horse. Johannes' face had no expression. At last, the young king said, "Johannes was faithful to my father, and to my father's father, and to my father's father's father. Before that, he has always understood us, so I will understand him. If he does it, it may be right." Not another word was said about the subject, and the party proceeded on foot back to the palace. When they arrived at the gate, they saw the beautiful golden bridal gown laying on a bed of purple roses. "Oh, I shall wear that to my wedding," the queen-to-be exclaimed, running to take a hold of the marvelous garment. Before she could reach it, Johannes grabbed it from the flower bed, strolled into the great hall, and threw it into the fire. The party was taken back with cries of shock and dismay. The servants huddled together and whispered, "Treason, treason." But the king hushed them. "Johannes has been faithful to me and my family, so I will be faithful to him. And if he does it, it may be right." The young king and the golden princess were married the very next day. The princess looked particularly beautiful, and her ocean blue eyes brimmed with joy. But Johannes watched anxiously. They moved to dance, and the music began. But they had not taken 2 steps when the queen suddenly swooned and fell to the ground. Before anyone could move, Johannes swept in, lifted her to his chest, and carried her out of the hall. He carried her through the empty hallways, carrying the new queen in his arms through the narrow, winding staircase that led him to the highest turrets of the castle, in his private chamber. When they arrived, he carefully took her to the floor, bent her over, and with his 2 rotten teeth bit the lip that drew blood. And ever so tenderly, the unhandsome man sucked 3 drops of blood from her lip into his mouth. The queen began to stir, but just then the king burst through the room. He had followed Johannes all through the palace and watched at the crack of the door as Johannes, his once faithful Johannes, had done something unspeakable to his new queen. "Treason!" he bellowed from the top of his lungs. "Treason!" The other servants quickly ran to the king's aid. "King," Johannes said, "please trust me." "Take him to the dungeon," the young king shouted. "Tomorrow he dies." The next day, Johannes was led from the dungeon to the top of the funeral pyre. There was hands tied to the torch and ready to be set the great stack of hay and tendered on fire. The king watched with his new queen at his side. She had fully recovered from the day before, but wore black, and their faces were somber. "He was like a father to me," said the young king. The queen took his hand. The executioner lit the torch and brought it to the pyre. Its sparks leaped eagerly onto the dry tinder. Behind the king, the jealous servants murmured and smiled to one another. Before the executioner could set the pyre alight, Johannes cried out, "King, to sworn to be faithful, and to my father, and to my father's father, and to your father's father's father, I was faithful before you. Will you allow me to speak before I die?" The young king sadly inclined his head and said, "Speak." And so Johannes spoke. He told of seeing 3 ravens on the ship. He told of hearing them speak. He told them of the prophecy of the chestnut stallion. And as told, he turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees. The specters gasped, but Johannes went on. He told of the raven's prophecy of the bridal gown, and as he did, he turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart. The crowd, mouths fell open. Finally, he told of the raven's prophecy of the wedding dance, and as he did, he turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head. And he died. A great wail went up from all assembled, for they have learned it was too late, that Johannes was faithful to the very end, and had given his life for his king. The king and the queen, in an effort to honor his memory, took faithful Johannes, grotesque even in stone, placed him beside their bed, so that every morning they woke up, and every evening when they lay down, they will be reminded of his faithfulness and the debt that they owed him. The end. Well, not really. More like the beginning. From here on out, the tale of Hansel and Gretel truly begins. The king and queen soon had a pair of beautiful twins, a girl and a boy. They named the boy Hansel and the girl Gretel. They were delights in their parents' lives. Hansel was dark like his father, with black curly hair and charcoal eyes. Gretel was fair like her mother, with hair that spun from pure gold thread and her eyes stone like the sea. They were happy children, full of play, mischief, and joy. So happy, in fact, that they nearly made their parents forget the faithful servant who saved their lives and how they betrayed them. Nearly, but not quite. And one day, as the king played with Hansel and Gretel at the foot of his bed, the queen was off in the chapel praying, he began to cry. "He understood me," the king said, though I had not understood him. He fell to the floor of the statue and wept. When his tears touched the stone, something miraculous happened. Johannes spoke. "There is a way, king," the stone Johannes said, "to rescue me from this rock, if you were to truly wish it." "Oh, I do," the king cried. "I'll do anything, anything." And Johannes said, "There's no young children in the room, right? You're certain? Okay." And Johannes said, "You must cut off the heads of your children and smear my statue with their blood. Only then will I return to life." Remember what I told you what happened when Hansel and Gretel finally showed up? This is it. The king collapsed on the bed, weeping, but he felt like he had no choice. "You understood me, always, no matter what," he said, "so I will understand you." He stood, beckoning Hansel and Gretel to come to his side. He drew his sword from its place on the wall and cut off their heads. Their lifeless bodies dropped to the floor. See? The king took their blood on his hands and smeared it onto the statue. Just as foretold, Johannes returned to life, covered in the children's blood. And the king, despite the blood, and through his tears of his own children's deaths, drew his arms around faithful servant Johannes. The end. Nearly. Johannes then smiled, his crooked smile, and said, "You have understood me at the greatest cost." And he placed Hansel's head back on his body and little Gretel's head back on hers, and instantly they began to leap and play as if nothing ever happened, and as if they were not covered in blood. The king then threw his arms around them, and then around Johannes, and they laughed with joy. The end. Almost. For just then the king heard the queen's footsteps echoing in the halls. He looked at Johannes, back from the dead, and their children covered in blood. Quickly, he said, and hurried them all in the wardrobe. When the queen came into the back into the room, he asked her how her prayers have gone. She replied, I can barely pray. I can only think of Johannes and how we failed him. The king replied, well, what if I told you, dear queen, that there was a way to repay our debt to Johannes and to bring him back to life, but it had to come in a terrible way, and it would cost us everything that we must hold dear? What would you say? Anything, cried the queen. Anything we can do, we must do. We owe him that. Even if it meant killing our own 2 children? The king asked. The queen gasped. She fell to the floor and wept bitterly. And at last she said, I would never do it. I would never do it. But if we should, we owe him our lives. I could not agree more, the king exclaimed. And that's why. And to this he opened the wardrobe doors, and out came their 2 beloved children, covered in blood, followed by a living, breathing Johannes. The queen screamed and fainted. The king threw a bucket of water in her face, and she woke up and screamed again. The king then explained it all to her, and she wept and laughed and threw her arms around her children, and then Johannes. And then she held them all at once, and wept and laughed some more. The end. Sorta. You see, the way that the Brothers Grimm tell it, that is the end. But not really. Not at all. For the queen recounted what happened to his wife. Hansel and Gretel heard and understood. Late that night, they laid in beds, unable to sleep. Hansel, Gretel said. Yes, Gretel? Well, did you hear what our father said? Yes. He cut off our heads to save that ugly old man. Hansel was silent. And Mama was glad that he did it. Do you think they hate us? Hansel silently was still. I think we should run away, Gretel said, just in case they want to do it again. I think that's what I'm thinking, Hansel said. Just what I was thinking. End of chapter 1.